Welcome back, everyone. The subject of human rights can often be a confusing one for investors, and there are common misconceptions over investors' roles in combating human rights abuses. To help clarify, the PRI has just released a new investor framework on human rights, and here to tell us more, here's the CEO of the PRI, Fiona Reynolds. Fiona.
Well, thanks, Susanna, and welcome everyone to day 2 of our EMEA Forum. I hope that you're all safe and well, and thanks for joining us for this session on human rights and investor program. And as Susanna said, today the PRI is releasing a new report on a 5-year human rights program. So the aim of this program is really to see all of our signatories understand, transform, and ultimately respect human rights. And our new report outlines a 3-step process for investors, including publishing a policy commitment, having a due diligence process in place, and enabling or providing access to remedy. And I always think it's fair to say that in the past, that social issues have often been treated by investors, by corporates, and by governments alike as really the poor cousin of the ESG issues. It's really taken a backseat to environmental and to governance issues. However, interest in social issues, in human rights, has grown significantly over the past few years. In a recent PRI survey, 64% of respondents said that COVID-19 has brought social issues that they were not already thinking about as a priority and onto their radar. In our 2019 reporting framework, signatories highlighted human and labour rights as priority issues. So we have some fantastic signatories who already do a lot in this space. In the last 5 years, approximately 115 institutional investors have engaged with more than 100 companies through PRI-led collaborative engagement using the UN Guiding Principles as a reference to improve human rights practices and disclosures. And according to the PRI's data portal, more than 120 investors are already screening their investment portfolios based on the UNGPs or on OECD guidelines. However, although we have this really fantastic core group of signatories who are doing this well and are very engaged on human rights issues, this just isn't the norm, and it doesn't represent the bulk of our signatory base. We have over 3,000 signatories, and what I'm pointing to is a couple of hundred. So we still have a long way to go. And I think this is because many institutional investors are still unaware or unclear on how to fulfill their responsibility to respect human rights, even though they're defined in international human rights standards and were formally and unanimously endorsed by the UN in 2011, and then immediately reflected in OECD standards. Expectations are growing, however, that investors respect human rights, and with this comes increased scrutiny on how human rights issues in the investment portfolios are monitored. And of course, a range of human rights are very familiar to PRI signatories because human rights cover things such as forced labour, diversity issues, health and safety, access to water, labour rights, just to name a few. But I think there continues to be an implementation gap in the investment industry when it comes to managing negative human rights outcomes more broadly. There also continues to be misconceptions about the investor role, and that's really what we're going to discuss today. So let me introduce our speakers. We have with us Dante, Pesce, who's a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Dante's generally in Chile, and we're having some connection issues just with the Wi-Fi. So we've got Dante at the moment on the phone line. You can see his picture there, but he's on the phone line, unfortunately. But at least we can hear him because he's got a lot of good things to say. And I'm also joined with Steve Waygood, who's the Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Aviva Investors. We, of course, want to involve you in the session, so make sure that you use the chat function and that you're sending in your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So Steve and Dante, thanks to both of you for being with us today. Let's start by discussing the many common misconceptions that persist when it comes to investor responsibilities. And Steve, I'm going to start with you. So even today, it's 2020, we're nearly in 2021, many investors still perceive their fiduciary duty to be really only about maximising risk-adjusted returns. So how does this responsibility to respect human rights fit with all of your investor duties?
Fiona, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's much appreciated. I also love the paper. I recommend everybody watching reads it and recommends it on Unintended. It's both well crafted in that it's not long, but also sufficiently sophisticated to deal with the complexity of these issues. So for anybody who's not looked at these issues in depth before, it's an excellent briefing. And even for those of us that have been working on it for a long time, I found it very useful. I particularly like the paradigm where it shifts a lot of our investment industry away from just thinking about human rights as something that we should engage on the companies that we own concerning and encourage better practice. It shifts the perspective much more towards, well, these are things that we should be doing ourselves because we owe a duty, if you like, as enshrined, as you say, by the OECD and the UN. Even as minority investors, we have duties too. And I think that's often overlooked. Unfortunately, the duties are around engagement, analysis, and encouraging companies to improve. So you asked the question about maximizing risk-adjusted returns, and I think that is often the way the question is put, but it's actually not the correct conception of the question. It is not actually our fiduciary duty to maximize risk-adjusted returns, whatever the cost to society and the environment. Part of what we should do, and fiduciary duty obviously varies in different jurisdictions, and I can't tell the PRI that. You've been working in this space for nearly 20 years, since before the PRI itself was launched. Of course, the Freshfield study in 2005 was critical to the actual conception of the principles around materiality. So what do I mean by this? I think the fiduciary duty is to the long-term interest of the beneficiaries. Our beneficiaries and everyone else's out there are not typically psychopathic. They wouldn't require us to own, think of a kind of conceptual example, Devil Incarnate Inc., which makes an enormous amount of profit in the short term, in the next few years, let's say, but in doing that destroys the planet and undermines culture, civilization, and human rights. Now, we wouldn't have a fiduciary duty to own that company and supply it capital. Why not? Because we also have a duty to market integrity. And maintaining market integrity, of course, is the role of regulators. But as investors, as regulated institutions, we also have a duty to maintain market integrity too. So it's not just about the fact that human rights are a material issue to the performance of companies and do affect cash flows, certainly affect the brand. It's also that we owe a duty to the market to maintain its own ongoing license to operate. And as an observation on the fiduciary duty debate, that bit is often overlooked, our duty to the market. Back to you, Fiona.
Thanks, and thanks for that outline, Steve. It continues to amaze me that we still do have all of these misconceptions. And you were talking about the 2005 Freshfields report, which was the foundation to be able to establish the PRI itself. And then, of course, we updated our work in 2016 and did fiduciary duty in the 21st century. And now we're doing some new work trying to move practice on around a legal framework for impact. So how do you basically make sure that you can prioritise and include sustainability outcomes in your work? But there still does seem to be a lot of misconceptions. So Dante, I want to come to you. So human rights are commonly seen as the concern of states, and companies and investors just follow existing law and regulation. But is that true in practice?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona, for the invitation, and sorry for the technological or the connection gap that we're having, but at least you can hear my voice. And also welcoming what you're launching today, because what is needed, and I will address that in a minute from now, is practical commitment from associations to mainstream what today are pockets of innovation and excellence, where the front runners are actually pushing the boundaries of what is possible. But then we have the majority of investors lagging a little bit behind, and we will like all of your members to catch up in this arena of business and human rights. So congratulations again. The UN Guiding Principles were unanimously endorsed by member states of the UN Human Rights Council in 2011 after a global multi-stakeholder consultation across world regions. And they have been taken up by a wide range of international and regional standards and initiatives, including the Sustainable Development Goals. They are also increasingly being codified in regional and national laws. But more importantly for today's conversation is that they are recognized and supported by all mainstream industry associations. All business enterprises, including investors, have a responsibility to respect human rights. As clarified in the guiding principles, this means that they should avoid infringing on the human rights of others and should address adverse human rights impacts which they are involved with. This responsibility applies in the context of any business-owned activities, but it also extends to human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, products, or services by their business relationships, even if they have not contributed to those impacts. This means that if investors are connected to impacts through their investments, they must play a role across their own institutions, but also in collaboration with others. The expectation that enterprises like investors play an active and ongoing role in embedding respect for human rights throughout their core business activities, such as throughout their investment activities, is widely settled.
Great, thank you. Steve, you mentioned when you were in your first comments about minority investors, and we often hear institutional investors say that as minority investors, they don't have influence. So what's Aviva's experience and what's your approach to this?
Our experience is that view's nonsense. We definitely have influence. We don't police the issues. So it's not something that we can be primarily responsible for policing all corporates on human rights. Of course, that's not the role of investors. But in terms of where an issue is raised to us by civil society or by regulators or perhaps by the media, what's our responsibility at that point? Well, I think we have a duty, and it's actually enshrined in the OECD guidelines, to engage with the companies to assess, particularly where the OECD national contact point suggests that the company is not adhering to the guidelines. We should engage and we should raise concern. Even minority investors have influence. I've only ever had one example in nearly 25 years, one example of a company that that refused to even reply to any requests for a meeting, let alone refuse the meeting itself. That one company then went on to experience some pretty bad media. It was Vedanta. Some of the people watching will recall the huge controversy about 10 years ago now. Now, most companies therefore take a meeting. You can use your voice as an owner to raise concern. If they don't respond to your issues, of course, you can vote against the pay, you can vote against the report and accounts, you can file shareholder resolutions. Even as minority investors, of course, in different jurisdictions, you have to work with others to have the right amount under management. But if that all fails, then of course you still have recourse to the media. This is, and also one can work with other civil society members too, as a responsible investor to promote better change. And people often think of the concept of free markets, and Milton Friedman talked about the business of business being business in his famous 1970 New York Times article. For anyone who actually reads the article, though, you'll see that he also talks about the responsibility being to adhere to generally accepted norms, as he puts it, ethical custom and regulation. So the concept that it's the responsibility of business to maximize returns at any cost is just nonsense. It's our duty as minority investors to do what we can to check that our agents are delivering for us.
Okay, Steve, I've got, I'm just going to bring in these questions that are coming in because they relate to a few things that you've been saying. So there's a couple of questions around, or comments around, interesting point on duty to market to maintain a license to operate, but is this enshrined in law? So that's one. And wrapped up in that, there is another one that says, Steve, is the duty to protect market integrity a duty in UK law? Should it be, especially vis-a-vis beta returns? And there's another one around, should this not be part of due diligence? So they're sort of wrapped up together. So I'm going to bring those to you now.
So the answer is yes, they are. They're particularly enshrined in the European Commission's understanding through FSMA, the understanding of how market participants should practice. And all of us who work on the buy or the sell side watching will know that market integrity is defined to include things like not front running, making sure we're dealing fairly. There's a whole series of transactions around money laundering and preventing that. These are all maintaining market integrity concepts and ensuring that we're also maintaining the license to operate of the market itself. These are already enshrined in law. For too long, our industry has focused in delivering our fiduciary duty, has just focused on its material to the individual investment decision, forgetting, as the questioner puts it, the impact that we can have on the market beta. Maintaining market integrity is a concept enshrined in law.
Thank you for that. Thanks for that. Dante, bringing you back in, given the breadth of issues that fall under the human rights umbrella, how do you think that investors should really prioritise issues? And is it appropriate for investors to tell companies what issues we want them to focus on? What's your views?
Yeah, thank you. The UN Guiding Principles focus on the power of robust and principled process. This is actually one of the main reasons why the UN Guiding Principles are so valuable for investors, given that the scope of potential and actual human rights impact connected with investment activities is extremely wide in most cases. The UN Guiding Principles equip investors with a framework that can be applied across the whole of portfolios, regardless of the sectors and locations associated with investees' companies. Using the guiding principles, investors can ground their investment decision-making and stewardship activities in driving meaningful policies, governance structures, human rights due diligence processes, and remedy practices within the companies that they invest in. Investors can and should engage companies on severe and common human rights issues known to be prevalent in a particular sector, location, or business model. You should prioritize use your own leverage in driving the kind of meaningful policies, processes, and practices that the UN Guiding Principles promote. Using the Guiding Principles framework, investors can ground their responsible investment practices in this principled and practical approach, stepping away from issue-by-issue advocacy and a narrow focus on specialized funds to apply an holistic management system across their full investment activities. Thanks.
Thanks. I've also got a question. I'll go to you first, Steve, although you might have a view as well, Dante. This is another question that's coming from the audience, and this one's from David, and it says, lots of talk about companies. What about engaging with sovereigns?
Yeah. What an excellent question, David. So here's clearly we don't vote in a democracy or even any other jurisdiction when you buy a share. Buy a sovereign bond. It's not like buying equity. So of course that's obvious. There's also democratic issues when you invest or when you give a company money, a country money. You're not actually they're not your agents. You're not the principal. Legally, it's very different. There's the democratic issues, of course. We wouldn't want the largest sovereign investors in the world dictating to countries. So there are democratic, there are legal, and there are practical issues here. But it doesn't mean there isn't an opportunity to engage. Did you want to say something, Fiona? I saw you.
No, keep going. Sorry.
I thought I might have been speaking too long. It is a habit of mine. It's a habit of mine to go on too much. But with the sovereign side of things, we can engage. And our CIO recently met alongside other CIOs, actually, the Russian foreign minister. We've also spoken to the environment minister in Brazil, the prime minister in Turkey, as investors in those jurisdictions in their sovereign. So you have got an opportunity to raise concern. But clearly, for example, we don't stand a plausible prospect of changing things like the death penalty in Saudi Arabia simply because somebody might own their sovereign. It doesn't work that way. So there is some opportunity, and there is, I would argue, some responsibility, but it isn't anything like as powerful or as strong as it is with being a minority investor in an equity where you have legal rights and, I think, duties. It's different, but there are similarities.
But Dante, do you want to add to that about the role of investors with sovereigns, engaging with sovereigns rather than companies?
Yeah, sure. The connection between business and governments is a tricky one because you will, let's say, in general, we need governments to step in and to clarify expectations and the expectations can be clarified in laws and then enforce them. And of course, we need an enabling environment for business to respect human rights. So we need actually governments to step in and do their part. But then the relation between investors and any kind of business and government can turn into the corporate capture of the state or the regulatory capture of the regulatory capture. And so, and in many places, we actually don't have real rule of law. We have laws, but they are not enforced, and we have high levels of corruption in a number of jurisdictions around the world. So very clearly, there is a clear role of business to step in, but I will say in some sort of more tricky conversations, we need to clarify the relation between money, investors, private actors, and state actors in a more constructive way. And it's basically a governance issue. And we can see very clearly regarding COVID-19 that when governance works, the response is better and the outcomes are better for all. So this is an area that we can surely make a better job and where we see better prospect of let's say, of an approach that is more constructive and in a win-win situation for the society and for all different players is when we have a coalition, when we have a group of companies acting together, using their collective leverage and engaging with a variety of governments, but not on an individual basis, but also more at the global governance level with the UN and all the governments, but then triggering that down into the national level. So this is a gray zone in most part of the world, and where a lot more can be done and better done for the sake of all the different players, including the investors.
Thanks. You mentioned COVID, Dante, so a good time to maybe bring COVID in here. So I'm going to go to you first, Steve, and then come back to you, Dante, on this. So do you think that COVID-19 will be an accelerator of human rights issues? COVID-19 has really highlighted so many social issues that we have problems with. So inequality, supply chain issues, labour rights, and people, as we're seeing, people feeling that they must go to work while they're sick as they won't get paid. In some of the richest countries in the world, how have we got to this point that this happens? And that's not even to mention suppliers who are not wanting to pay supply chains and then therefore leaving workers vulnerable down in those supply chains as well. So do you believe, like me, that as well as a focus on climate, when it comes to building back better, that we really need to be focusing on these social issues? I really feel that we need a new social contract that needs to be developed, that the one that we have is broken. So I just want your view, Steve, around the whole COVID issue and human rights, whether you might think completely the opposite, that it's not going to be an accelerator, but I'm hoping that it is and that we can capitalise on this.
I think you.
Sorry, I'll go to Steve first.
Yeah. Dante, forgive me. I'll be reasonably brief and then come to you, of course. So I think the COVID situation, I think you can't work in the responsible investment area and not take opportunities like this for what they are. They are opportunities to deliver, as you suggested, a new social contract. There clearly have been profound implications for hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of people around the world where their own human rights have been tested. Their right to life, their right to health, their civil rights community, I think, have also been, they've had their own health relatively more tested than others. So the Black, Asian, minority ethnic community have obviously disproportionately suffered for their own, because of all sorts of socio-political reasons, as well as biological ones too. So there've been definitely labour standards issues called out, inequality issues called out. I think properly understood, COVID is probably the world's biggest contemporary environmental issue that became a massive social problem that's presented huge governance challenges to companies and countries alike. And it does represent an opportunity. And I recall the Business Roundtable, and it was big news, wasn't it, just over a year ago when they issued their new statement of the purpose of a corporation. It's interesting, we've just recently analysed all the companies that have signed it. Only around a third of them are even signatories to the Global Compact. And the average score in the corporate human rights benchmark of all those that are ranked, which is only about a fifth of them, their average score is around 35%. So these are mainly US businesses that have signed up to this new purpose statement. Hardly, or certainly not the majority of them, have even signed the compact. And in terms of those that are supposed to be practicing good human rights, their average score is around 35%. This is not a very good track record for some of the world's largest US businesses. So that opportunity you refer to, Fiona, hasn't been met by the Business Roundtable, even though it got a lot of press. Their performance is poor. We need to look at our own, if you like, our own processes and procedures, our own ranking and rating, and publicly hold companies to account much more than we have. We all too often do things privately. We need, on behalf of our clients, we need to be much bolder and braver. And this is a massive opportunity to do just that. Dante?
Yeah, well, I would like to second what you're saying, Steve. We can and we should and we have to deliver a new social contract, putting humans at the center of the building back better or building a better future. The evidence is speaking by itself. This is a crisis that shows a failure in governance that unveils issues that were there already, but they were not properly addressed. And we have, let's say, the day after the pandemic, we will remain with a number of issues pending. Inequality and climate change are crises of even greater magnitude of COVID-19, but they are somehow in slow motion, happening on slow motion. And right now, this is a test for our capacity to respond, to anticipate, to respond, and to solve a societal crisis. But it's the same infrastructure that we need to put in place to address all the other societal urgencies. And this is a great opportunity. It's a tragedy in one hand, but it's a great opportunity to re-examine what we have done well, but also re-examine what we have not done well. And actually the responses from some countries and jurisdictions has been much better than others. And there are a number of lessons there to be learned. Very clearly, the collaboration, very clearly transparency, very clearly science, very clearly evidence, very clearly competence. Are elements that are key to get us through this crisis, but actually are the same elements that we need to put in place that will get us through the crisis that remains.
Yeah, I do think that one of the pleasing things from my perspective, at least in my role at the PRI, is during the COVID-19 crisis, I did see our signatories, investors in general, just so much more engaged around social issues. So many who were really stepping up to make sure that the engagement that they were having with companies, of course, was about, what crisis management plans were you putting in place and how are you going to manage through COVID-19, but was also about sending clear messages about their expectations of how they manage their employees, what they were doing, wanting to know what they were doing with their human capital management plans, and wanting to ensure that they were doing things around suppliers and supply chains. And we spent a lot of time on these issues, and a lot of signatories came together to work on them, which was great. Now, I've got so many questions, so I just want to make sure that we get to a lot of them. One question's about, is the paper on the website? And yes, it will be after this session. The paper will be there. There's a question here. This comes from Alex, and it says, and it comes to the reference you made about the media, Steve. So, when does going to the media about a human rights issue become an issue for the asset value, and how do you manage this?
That is a very big and important issue to balance. So, where we've done it has been when, in the particular case I mentioned earlier, the company wouldn't reply. So we couldn't even get a meeting. We were a tiny minority investor. Getting a meeting was really difficult. So when you go to the AGM, there are journalists there. So if you're raising concern, you need to do it in a way that's delicately put and in the interests of the business as well as our beneficiaries. So given that human rights are such an important material consideration for companies, the tone you adopt has to be careful and appropriate to the fact that we're the principal of the business and they are our agents, and they are elected to represent our interests, and what they do needs to adhere to generally accepted standards and custom. Now, we shouldn't go along and present this as a campaign in the way that an NGO would. But inevitably, the AGM of the business, it's, if you like, its parliament, is a matter of public record. There are journalists there. So I think it's one of tone and it's one of authority, and it's a balancing act we need to adopt. It is not our duty at all. In fact, it's quite against our duty to go in there and try and score points off the company and materialize the issue, if you like, using the press. So that does actually cut against what some of the comms teams would want to do. In terms of generating PR, but there is a fine balancing act to be struck, and it is, I think, as part of the mandatory human rights due diligence movement. It is going to be the case that obviously the companies we own are going to have to do this much more, particularly across Europe, and that's a very welcome fact. But our own due diligence and how we then protect, remedy, as well as respect comes to the fore. And I think the remedy, partly it is calling out bad performance publicly, partly it is protecting human rights defenders, but it's not an unfettered responsibility. We need to have regard to what our role and duties are. Dante, did you want to add anything? Sorry, Fiona, back to you.
Yeah, just one short thing is that transparency and accountability is part of just good governance, and hyper-transparency is something that is already here and is going to stay. But also to say that credibility is gained and lost in regarding access to remedy. So when things go wrong, that is when you actually show how true you are to your commitment. So that will be my only additional contribution to this point.
I just wanted to add to this point. I do think this media issue could be quite difficult because, last year I chaired a global commission on modern slavery and human trafficking. And one of the things is, in talking a lot about this issue, is you actually want people to find. You want them to do the work and you want them to find what's happening in their supply chain. So if they've got instances of it, it's actually a good thing that they find it, because then we can say, what are you doing about it? And the problem can be fixed. But what happens is that sometimes that companies are so scared about what's going to happen in the PR side that they just say there isn't a problem and they don't investigate properly. So in some times we actually need to celebrate that the company's done the work, that they've found the problem, that they're highlighting it, and that they're taking steps to address it. So I think we do have to be careful about how we go sometimes about the media messaging around these issues.
Just to add a brief point back to that one, I recall some of the other viewers will remember the Nike and the Gap problems that they've had with children in their supply chain. And when that issue was first brought up, nearly 20 years ago now, by some of the campaigners, the first response of the companies was to look at their supply chain, find the children, and make sure that they were no longer working in the factories. Subsequent studies found that those children ended up in prostitution often. That is clearly worse than having a low-paid job as a child. So the unintended consequences of going to the media on human rights can also be profound. So that point you just made, Fiona, I just want to echo and amplify it, because we need to be conscious of those unintended consequences. And once the media genie is out of the bottle, it's impossible to control. One needs to be careful.
And it was interesting. Well, you do, and it was interesting talking to a journalist about the commission blueprint that we put out. A couple of journalists, all they were interested in was a headline about who were the worst companies. They weren't interested in what companies were doing or what investors were doing. I want a story that's going to talk about ABC company being terrible, and it can get difficult. Anyway, we've got so many questions, and I've got an important one here, I think. I'll give it to you first, Steve. It's from Andy, and he's talking about emerging markets and saying different disclosure levels, cultural backgrounds, and economic priorities. And the question is how to calibrate.
Not sure I entirely follow the question. So if we're saying that the norms are different and culture and practices are different within jurisdictions and different regions, that's true. There are clearly, we can't be culturally insensitive or neo-imperialist as we go about our engagement approach. Absolutely, 100% agreed, and that's been understood, I think, within our community for a few decades. There are, though, this is really the role of the UN, and the UN supported, as it is, principles for responsible investment. The UN has also very usefully codified global norms, and not all of them are always ratified and signed, but they are a very, very good starting point. The ILO Core Labour Standards, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, even the Rio Declaration back in '92, they provide a structure and a global normative framework that we can use in our advocacy, in our research, and in our particular engagement with companies. So you can't be neo-imperialist and culturally insensitive. And of course, ethics and religion vary importantly around the world in all sorts of different ways. And it's not our money. It's for them to judge what they do with their money. But yes, I'd point to the role of the UN and other international standard setters and the OECD guidelines too. The problem there, though, is of the hundreds of thousands of companies that the OECD guidelines technically cover, there's only ever been just under 500 cases, and only around 10% of them come to a conclusion. So we really don't have a monitoring mechanism. The norms set out by the UN are not a monitoring mechanism. They're a framework for considering performance. The OECD guidelines are not well monitored and enforced. And so what I'd like to see with the review that's being done of the Ruggie framework and the UN Guiding Principles, I think the next decade needs to include consideration of the build out of something like a select committee in the Office of the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, where people can bring cases and they can be well considered and all the nuance balanced before a judgment is made. That, I think, needs to be part of the future.
Okay, we're running out of time, sadly. But Dante, you're talking about the UN norms, Steve, and definitely within the report and the framework that we've put out, it's all underpinned by the UN guiding principles and by the OECD guidelines. But Dante, just really, really quickly, what can investors expect in the road ahead when it comes to the implementation of the UNGPs?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. But I would like to make a small comment regarding the differences among regions and stages of development and maturity, because the guiding principles, and Steve said it well, the UN, it's made out of all governments, and the UN guiding principles were unanimously endorsed by the Human Rights Council. That means all governments are behind them, not only the most developed or sophisticated countries of today. And actually, the governance of the guiding principles is on the shoulders of 5 individuals, one like me, who is not from Western Europe or North America. So 4 out of the 5 governance members driving the implementation of the guiding principles are actually not from the North, you can say. We are from the global South, and therefore that is a way to make sure that all voices are captured and all perspectives and cultural differences are taken on board. And so we have the same aim. The goal is the same, but we recognize that we are in different stages, speeds, capacity. But the good news is that we don't have pushback from governments or pushback from business, explicit pushback. We have some pushback in reality, but we don't have explicit pushback to say, this doesn't apply to me, this is too much, or this is a cultural imposition, because the beauty of the principles is that they came out of a consensus and an international agreement of all governments, plus the support of all stakeholders, and that gives us good foundations to look into the future. And going forward, investors can expect a much more focused lens from the international community on the role of financial actors in making respect for human rights a reality. We already see reflections on this in the regulatory context with the EU sustainable finance disclosure requirements and taxonomy, as well as multiple mandatory human rights due diligence legislative efforts covering financial actors, including investors. As we approach the 10th anniversary of the guiding principles in June 2021, the working group is taking stock of implementation of these expectations to date through our UNGP's 10 Plus project. While we see some leading practices from the investor community regarding their own human rights responsibility, this is a key area where we need to further speed and scale up action. To reflect this, we have a dedicated investor track as part of the UNGP plus the 10 Plus project that is explicitly focused on this area through various multi-stakeholder consultations and position papers, including the engagement with you, Fiona, and UN PRI. Yep. We welcome the PRI human rights framework as an important reflection that PRI will be supporting the investment community responsibility to respect human rights. And we are also encouraged to see very practical tools for investors in the form of the Investors Toolkit on Human Rights or the OECD guidance for institutional investors. Respect for human rights is no longer a nice-to-have proposition for investors. This is the moment that investors need to understand and embed respect for human rights as part of their normal practices. And thank you again.
And that is a great way to, I think, start to wrap up. There's so many questions we couldn't get to, unfortunately. Thanks for all of them. I'm going to try and make sure that we along with the paper, that we can get some answers to some of the other questions that were there, because there's some great questions, and thank you. But really, look, just as part of our next 3-year strategy, we are going to support our signatories in putting human rights at the core of responsible investment. Really, we want to deliver a transformational contribution to the achievement of the SDGs. And this is what we've set out to do within our 10-year blueprint for responsible investment. I'd also add that the PRI is looking to introduce signatory reporting specifically on human rights, first on a voluntary basis from January 2022, 2022, followed by mandatory public reporting from 2023. So we really invite you all to read the PRI's latest paper on human rights, launched today. You can find the paper on our website, which is www.unpri.org. Really, for me, my aim is that in the next 5 years, that human rights are like climate. All investors are considering them. They're embedding them into their investment process and reporting. It's a key part of their engagement strategy. And even though signatories may be at different stages of their journey, some more advanced than the others, that everybody is doing something. So I really hope that you can join me in making this aim a reality. I want to thank so much Steve and Dante for your time today and for being part of the panel. Thank you all for tuning in, and please stay safe and stay well. Thank you, everyone.